Okay, bon après-midi.
Good afternoon, everyone. Happy New Year. I would like to welcome all of the members of the committee. It's been a little while since we've seen each other, and I hope you had great holidays. I hope you're also ready to start up again on this study on the federal policy regarding freshwater.
We have two panels. I offer my apologies to the panelists for the delays that occurred in the House around voting. We have in the first panel Mr. Caleb Ben as an individual, will be speaking as an individual. From the International Observatory on Nature's Rights, we have Yenny Vega Cardenas and Amélie Delage, and from the Saskatchewan Association of Rural Municipalities, we have Mr. Ray Orb. And from West Coast Environmental Law Association, we have Deborah Carlson. We'll start with the 5-minute opening statements, and we'll go to you, Mr. Ben.
Chair,
yes.
Just point of order.
Yeah.
Minister Guilbeault promised to get the names back from the senators that he was talking to about Bill C-234, and I don't know if you've heard back from him or not. We've issued a letter.
Is that a point of order? But I can find out. I can ask him.
Okay.
Okay, I'll ask him tomorrow when I see him.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. Can we start with Mr. Ben for 5 minutes?
Salutations. Can you hear me? So, my name is Caleb Bain. I'm I appear in my individual capacity. I acknowledge my presence in unceded and occupied Algonquin territory. It's such an honor and privilege to be here, and to Mr. Chair in particular, I'd like to honor and hold up the work you've done on freshwater in many years previous. So, duly noted. To the committee and to others, to Natalie, the clerk, for being so helpful, I'm so grateful and so honored to be here. I think that humans' relationship to the non-human is going to be the defining challenge of all governments around the planet in the 21st century. I think freshwater is going to be one of the key mechanisms and modes and mediums by which that challenge will manifest. I understand today that we're talking about freshwater rights, quote unquote, and of course, as I think others have made in their testimony and others today will make in their testimony, in particular and others, rights and responsibilities are intrinsically connected. And for those who serve the public, I hold you up because you live your responsibilities relative to the rights that Canadians hold. My core point is that because of this defining complexity of the 21st century, we are going to have to confront our relationship to nature, our relationship to the non-human, whether that's artificial intelligence or based upon whatever crazy footage that is non-human intelligence on this planet or whatever else. What is coming and what you see already, like the back-to-back atmospheric rivers in Vancouver, or Pangatang being the hottest city in Canada this last month, or the unprecedented droughts in various locations. The fact that in my territory in northeastern British Columbia, I come from West Mobility First Nations. My mom's reserve, but I'm registered to my dad's reserve, Fort Nelson First Nations. We've had a 45-degree difference in the last 3.5 weeks, from -40 to +8, +9. What I propose is that the legal, political, and academic processes of this country do not have sufficient iterative capacity to evolve relative to the challenges of the 21st century. Freshwater is going to be one of the defining challenges of what is coming. And what I propose to the committee with the utmost respect is, out of your recommendations and processes, we look at challenges to freshwater not as crises. And as I've seen in others' testimony, there are crises across the board. There are forthcoming crises. There are past crises like the First Nations, freshwater reality that I used to work on extensively. But what is coming, in my view, requires us to deeply think about these crises as opportunities. To this end, I'm going to recommend, and I'll explain why, this committee optimize the federal government's creative and courageous leadership in collaboration with all orders of government, from the micro, from municipalities, to the medial, regions, provinces, territories, and the macro, federal and international, to engage the question of fresh water. I think that can be done. I've read the testimonies of others, and I think I understand the forthcoming testimonies of others. This is a consistent message, whether it's academia, the private sector, advocacy groups, non-governmental organizations, the Assembly of First Nations, where I have the privilege to work as the Director of Rights, although I'm appearing on an individual basis. There is consistent messaging that creative and courageous leadership is needed. Canada, because of its multi-juridical nature, has a uniquely capable mechanism with, in certain cases, provincial UN Declaration implementation legislation, such as that from British Columbia, and at the federal level, and I'd like to encourage and hold up all members of Parliament for passing the UN Declaration implementation legislation recently. It's a project I was deeply involved in and remain involved in. The National Action Plan, the annual reporting processes, all of these things are mechanisms to illustrate and obviously referred to in others' testimony as bases and components of how this government and us as a society, as a nation state, interface. But my point is that our interface with the natural world is actually what's going to be the defining problem of the 21st century. I think that First Nations laws and legal orders are the only basis from a rights-based perspective, and we will speak to rights as a question, that can help us evolve rapidly without engaging the division of powers and the cooperative federalism problem, the politicization, weaponization of particular issues, projects, endeavors, so that collective solutions can be achieved. I think that fresh water is going to be the defining nexus of our relationship to the non-human in the 21st century. I think that you have to seriously consider what is likely to come. There are black swan events on an ongoing and regular basis. All of you and all of your ridings are seeing unanticipated problems, the PFAS testimony, et cetera, microplastics. There's myriad issues, and I'm not going to go into it, although I'll be making supplementary written submissions afterwards. My core point is that right relationship to the non-human and water. I was thinking about the Canada Water Agency, and I'll end with this, and then I'm going to give you some visions for the future. The Canada Water Agency has not queried the question of what is the agency of water, and I don't offer that as some trite turn of phrase. I say that in a genuine, intentional way. I think this nation state, despite its horrific history relative to my people and my family, under the guise of law, sending my dad to residential school at 5 years old to be abused, has great potential. So I offer these visions for the committee. One, in 30 years, an Indigenous language-based coding system is invented in Vancouver that interfaces with the orcas and the salmon and the freshwater and saltwater space in Vancouver, and tells the regulatory agency, which is both human, non-human, and First Nations-led, that there's an exceedance of a given compound, and that exceedance leads to a rapid response mechanism. Recognizing time, Mr. Chair, perhaps I'll end there. I have other ideas.
I really appreciate that you started this conversation, because it really opens the door to the issues we need to explore. So thank you. But I'm sure there will be many questions which will allow you, Mr. Ben, to expound on those points. And we'll go now to, is it Ms. Cardenas who will be speaking?
Oui, bonjour à toutes et à tous.
Yes, indeed. Hello, everyone. Thank you to the committee for inviting us. We are honored to be here today, along with Emily, who is also a member of the International Observatory on Nature's Rights. I am a lawyer, and I have also worked with the UN. My name is Emily Delage. I am a PhD at McGill and an intern. Thank you for having us here. Today, we'd like to insist on three major points. First, talk about clarifying the idea of water in Canada. The observatory considers that we have to move from an anthropocentric perspective to an environmental one. We also want to insist on the necessity of having tools to protect environment. We'd like to potentially implement a tribunal or a court for water that is specialized. It's been 15 years since we've started researching water management systems around the world. There have two water constitutions, if you will, that are opposing one another. One is that water is a fundamental right, and the other one allows the marketing and sale of water. However, both those visions neglect a crucial element. Water is an essential sacred element that is necessary to life for all species on Earth. Water is life itself, as the greatest nations say, and it is alive. Our observatory wants human rights to be recognized for water, but we also want to promote the recognition that water is part of an ecosystem and one that has rights. Water is not there just for our own benefit. It is actually part of an ecosystem, and therefore we have to share it with other species that we are sharing the world with. We have a holistic approach, and therefore we must respect water. We also have to act towards it not as owners, but as guardians. A system of governance that would recognize these rights would allow us to become more responsible as towards water. The observatory has made some proposals and has proposed bills to recognize the rights of the Saint Laurent River. There are various Quebec municipalities, NGOs, and research centers who have provided support, as well as the Labrador and Quebec Indigenous nations. Last year, in April, they emitted a legal order that I can share with you. So these are novel tools. We have a new vision that would allow us to preserve and restore water and protect water in ecosystems. That is everyone's responsibility. This governance statute would have three major points. There would be various committees, such as a strategic one and a scientific one, that would allow for a collaborative and participative collaboration. We would include various sectors, such as fisheries and so on, but we would also include access to drinking water, for example. This model would allow us to include all stakeholders so that we can all agree on various compromises that would allow us to preserve water ways. In order to do that, we want to set up a special tribunal for water and develop legal aspects that over time. The Canada Water Agency wants to implement this tribunal as well. Recognizing water as human rights would allow us to improve the management of water, its quality, and have and better manage national water plans. It also has to do with Indigenous rights, and therefore this would amount to a historic collaboration. This legal framework would allow us to recognize the responsibility of various sectors across Canada. So you are in a privileged position to change the status quo and send a message to our children, grandchildren, and so on that you have really made a difference and that they can swim in rivers in Canada, drink water, and do water sprouts, and that our agricultural products, for example, are well taken care of. Thank you. As mentioned earlier, there will be a lot of questions.
Saskatchewan Association of Rural Municipalities, Mr. Orb, who is by video conference. Go ahead, you have 5 minutes, please.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chairman. My name is Ray Orb, and I'm president of Saskatchewan Association of Rural Municipalities, known as SARM. I was born and raised and live in the small farming community of Cupar, which is northeast of Regina, with a population of about 625 people. I'd like to thank the Standing Committee on Environment and Sustainable Development for the opportunity to share our association's thoughts as it studies freshwater in Canada and the role of the federal government. SARM has been the voice of rural Saskatchewan and has served its membership of Saskatchewan's rural and municipal governments for over 100 years. Today, I express our viewpoints of those we represent, delving into rural perspectives on fresh water in Canada and explaining how the role of the federal government might influence our livelihoods in rural Saskatchewan. Agriculture is the backbone of Saskatchewan's rural economy, and it relies heavily on a consistent and reliable supply of fresh water, especially for groundwater and water for irrigation. Crops and livestock require sufficient water to thrive, ensuring food security for not only our country, but also for our customers abroad. We need fresh water to sustain the livelihoods of countless families, not just in Saskatchewan, but across Canada. And by working collectively, the federal government will better understand the dynamics and potential harmful impacts on watershed and groundwater recharge, along with ensuring agriculture access and resiliency to sustainable high-quality water. It would also be essential for the agency to leverage other federal government entities such as the Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada, the Pest Management Regulatory Agency, Environment and Climate Change Canada to consider all the potential impacts on a larger scale. SARM voiced concerns some time ago about creating a Canada Water Agency. We are concerned that we will have duplication since we already have a Saskatchewan Water Security Agency and a strong entity in the Saskatchewan Ministry of Environment. In essence, water and water quality is a multi-jurisdictional issue and must be dealt with in that manner. Although we are not in favor of this agency, we do anticipate the agency will need transparency with the provinces. To achieve strong working relationships with the provinces, we recommend sharing data and knowledge, engaging with agencies, councils, and organizations in each province on proposed changes to freshwater to consider impacts to all sectors of each province. Leverage the knowledge of local and regional networks involved in water management in each province and further strengthen their sources and ensure that there is a sense of respect for jurisdiction and constitutional authority in each province. Continuing to dialogue with SARM on issues that affect farmers, ranchers, and rural municipalities. Saskatchewan is an active participant in water management. An example of our actions can be sought out in the Diefenbaker Irrigation Expansion Project. Saskatchewan provides funding through associations and programs, such as the Saskatchewan Irrigation Projects Association and the Farm and Ranch Water Infrastructure Program, to ensure farmers and producers can work together to provide freshwater access across Saskatchewan. A primary focus of the agency should be on funding water management projects across Canada to ensure provinces can work efficiently and effectively to preserve freshwater resources. With additional funding stability and support beyond the province of Saskatchewan borrowing money from the Canadian Infrastructure Bank, the federal government could help provinces dramatically in making a bigger impact on freshwater resources. The Saskatchewan Water Security Agency is working toward developing the Saskatchewan Agriculture Water Stewardship Policy, which aims to preserve, restore, and protect the wetlands in Saskatchewan. And on a larger scale, the agency will need to develop a sustainable and resilient freshwater management strategy that works with all provinces. This strategy will be essential to help provinces adapt to these federal changes and mitigate potential risks. It is crucial that the federal government, provinces, and territories work together to ensure to build a sustainable future for generations to come. So in closing, on behalf of our member rural municipalities and rural Saskatchewan, we thank the Standing Committee for the opportunity to lend our voice to this important conversation. And we look forward to continued dialogue to work together to further the best interests of all Canadians. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Orb. We'll go to Ms. Carlson. I'm told that because of technical difficulties, it will be possible for Ms. Carlson to deliver her opening statement, but it won't be possible to engage her in a Q&A because the interpreters won't be able to for technical reasons. But they have her brief, so they can so in both languages, and therefore she can go ahead and give her opening statement. Ms. Carlson.
Thank you. Good afternoon to committee members. My name is Deborah Carlson, and I'm a staff lawyer at West Coast Environmental Law. We are a not-for-profit law organization based in Vancouver on the Coast Salish territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh peoples, and that's where I'm calling from today. Thank you for the invitation to speak to this committee about freshwater rights. I'll share some reflections on rights in freshwater, and then based on the work we're doing in the Lower Fraser region, I'll offer 2 recommendations for your consideration. So one place we see freshwater rights, and this is in line with what you've already heard, is in laws like the BC Water Sustainability Act, which contains a water allocation regime. And under this law, water users obtain water licenses, and this is used to manage conflict over a scarce resource. But like last year, as BC experienced yet another hot, dry summer, there were temporary orders needed to restrict water use in order to protect fish. And in a changing climate with more summer droughts, we're only going to see more instances where we really bump into water scarcity as a reality. Legal rights to water, as you've heard, can also deal with water quality. Only Quebec has legislated a human right to clean water, but as you know, the Canadian Environmental Protection Act was amended last year to include a human right to a healthy environment. And of course, there can also be rights of nature and rights for nature, and I believe you've heard about that as well. So this is water through the lens of rights, but at their heart, these examples reflect our relationships with fresh water as governed by federal and provincial law. So it's scarce, but we're allowed to be demanding consumers whose activities then need to be restrained. This is only happening at the point of crisis. Second, our laws allow us to gauge activities that introduce harmful substances into fresh water, and despite advances in technology, there's still problems with well-known contaminants as well as new ones, and we're not managing the cumulative effects. And this is another important point. The tools that we rely on are a variety of federal and provincial laws, and they're not particularly coordinated to manage these relationships. So we do this in a very fragmented way. But again, as you've heard, there are clear opportunities to have more holistic and reciprocal relationships with water, and we need them, especially in a changing climate. And we can look towards Indigenous laws and practices because they have supported sustainable and adaptable ways of living on the landscape for millennia and millennia. So I have 2 quick recommendations about the Canada Water Agency linked to the work that we're doing and supporting in the Lower Fraser region. So the first is to ensure that the Canada Water Agency is fully resourced and has the support required across federal departments to achieve its stated mandate to act as a point of coordination for federal programs and activities, including funding that affect freshwater. In the Lower Fraser, there's a salmon crisis. The science is clear that freshwater habitat protection and restoration, including fish passage, is essential. At the same time, this densely populated region, Canada's Pacific Gateway, is exposed to catastrophic flood risks, and it needs to move on from outdated and ineffective flood control practices. There are win-win-wins to be had from adopting integrated floodplain management strategies, and they're intimately connected with managing our freshwater relationships. We're part of the Lower Fraser Floodplains Coalition, a group that's working with the First Nations-led Emergency Planning Secretariat to lead a new collaborative process with First Nations, local governments, farmers, and the BC government to plan for floodplain resilience, including nature-based infrastructure. We're seeing success. through dialogue, relationship building, and emerging ideas for flood risk reduction and resilience involve transportation, agriculture, fish habitat restoration, addressing historical inequities with First Nations, on-the-ground implementation of UNDRIP, etc. This work touches many federal departments, from Environment and Climate Change Canada to Infrastructure, Fisheries, Public Safety Canada, Natural Resources Canada, and so on. And it would be so helpful if they were all rowing in the same boat. So we do see a valuable role for the agency in coordinating and perhaps catalyzing freshwater objectives across federal departments, looking at both regulation and funding programs. The second recommendation is to ensure that the proposed freshwater data strategy supports regional priorities and needs for freshwater ecosystem management, restoration, and resilience building. And this strategy should be co-developed with Indigenous peoples, such as the First Nations in the Fraser River region. The data strategy should include indicators that can use to evaluate trends. Capacity and connections with academic institutions in the region should also be promoted. And the First Nations principles of ownership, control, access, and possession should be followed. So in closing, we have a lot of opportunity to manage our relationships with water better. It means managing ourselves in the landscape. So we need to do this in a more holistic and integrated way, and we have ideas and opportunities to do so.
Merci beaucoup, Madame Carlson.
Thank you, Ms. Carlson. We will now move on to the question portion. Mr. Mazur, on to you.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you for the witnesses for coming out today. My questions will be for Mr. Orb online there. Was SARM consulted by the federal government on the Canada Water Agency? And if so, were you satisfied with the consultation process?
Thanks for the question, Mr. Mazur. We weren't consulted directly, but we inquired some time ago when we heard that there was going to be a possibility of a water agency office in Regina, Saskatchewan. And we did meet with someone from the federal government who was part of the bureaucracy, and the answers that we received at that time were very vague, as to I think they are now. We don't know what the mandate of the water agency is. We know they're concerned about fresh water, of course, and that includes, for our producers, drinking water. But we simply haven't been provided enough answers. And as I mentioned, we're concerned about the creation of this agency.
It's needless to say you are opposed to the development of the water agency, but I think in a few of the witnesses commented on here it is developing, like getting rid of the bureaucracy, and so the local level can actually deal with water issues. Would you agree with that statement? Like, I think, as not being a farmer myself and working out there, I've often lamented about how if people would, government just get out of the way and let the locals, let the municipalities, and even the provincial government figure it out. They're living on the landscape. They're the ones directly impacted. If government could ever create an agency like that, I don't think it would be the first time ever, right?
Well, I think it would be probably the first time ever, but definitely I think the people that know the best about what happens on their own land would be, with obviously First Nations people who are our neighbors in a lot of cases in this province. But it's the farmers and ranchers and their families that live on this land. They require, safe water for their drinking of their own, for their families, but also for the animals that they raise on their farms. And so that's why we're concerned about duplication, issues we have had in the past with DFO, when we had DFO officers in Regina that seemed to have the mandate of trying to find a fish on some farm where there was not really a stream. Certainly not a river, and just the bureaucracy of, in doing our municipal projects, it does hold the projects up, and it increases the cost of the projects as well.
Yeah, and I was going to bring up the Department of Fisheries and Oceans. I too had, I guess, experienced them with those regulations back in the 90s, and I think this goes back to why we're so suspicious of developing another federal agency. And DFO still hasn't really cleaned up their act. I've been talking to the Fisheries Committee and some of the people are over there. That sounds like it's more of a mess than ever, and especially when they come into landlocked areas. It creates a lot of problems for not only the department heads in there, but also the people that are living on the land. So instead of creating solutions, they're actually creating problems for all involved. Would you recommend that the federal government obtain approval from all provinces before legislating the Canada Water Agency so jurisdictional concerns can be addressed?
Yeah, definitely. That's why I mentioned constitutional rights, because we know that provinces have rights over some of their resources, and we believe that water is really a resource. Understanding that the federal government does have some jurisdiction over federal water, there's no doubt about that. But definitely, they need to consult with provinces like Saskatchewan. Our municipalities, like every other, I think, province, we're a creation of our provincial government, and so our provincial government here, as you may know, is not in favor of a creation of another agency when we already have a water agency in this province that has a mandate to provide safe drinking water and allocation for irrigation and things like that. And I think they're doing a good job, and that's why we think there needs to be no duplication.
Do you have any recommendation on what types of projects the Canada Water Agency could support or fund? If you could create the water agency yourself, what would it look like to you?
Well, even though I might not be very popular right now in Saskatchewan, if I did have the mandate to do something, it would be to look at the Lake Diefenbaker expansion project. And I think there is a role there for the federal government. And I remember meeting with Minister Goodale years ago when Ralph Goodale was our Minister of Corrections and Public Safety. And he mentioned that we need a big project in this province to create a lot of jobs and to provide more irrigation to produce food. And the federal government needs to, I think about the role of a water agency perhaps is to co-fund the expansion at Lake Diefenbaker. And the province of Saskatchewan simply cannot do it on their own. Asking the province to go to an infrastructure bank and borrow the money, and we're talking billions of dollars, I don't think that's fair for a province like Saskatchewan. And I think that's the role for the federal government, is to provide infrastructure funding like Diefenbaker expansion to the province of Saskatchewan.
There's only like 15 seconds. Yeah, okay. Mr. Longfield.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to the witnesses. It's great to be back studying water. I want to start with Mr. Bain. When I'm thinking of water and the rights around water, we've recently had Minister Haidu introduce Bill C-61, that's going to be key in establishing new proposed safe drinking water and wastewater legislation in consultation with First Nations. The last piece of consultation is really the critical piece, and the commitment that is coming forward from the federal government of $1.55 billion from 2024-25 and 2025-26 supporting clean drinking water on First Nations. One thing I'm concerned with is that we start with clean water, and how do we get to clean water as a right, and then how do we maintain that once we've eliminated all the boiled water advisories that are occurring in First Nations. I was in the Nan Nation by Dryden several years ago now, and one of the elders said, stop poking holes in Mother Earth, give us clean water to start, and we don't have this problem. And it was really a simple but very profound statement that I've taken with me, and I've brought it to different committees that we've been studying issues around the rights around water. Could you talk about maybe the funding and how critical it is to have ongoing funding where the intersection of water, energy, Indigenous law all meet, and as you mentioned, other living beings?
No pressure.
No, I don't have much time, but I wanted to hear your perspective as well as you can articulate.
With the consent of the committee, I'll put written submissions on one aspect of that.
Sure.
My core proposition is that the iterative process of legal evolution and policymaking in this country, financially, politically, socially, and legally, are not capable of adapting to the challenges. Whilst I am receptive to and cognizant of the massive amount of advocacy led by, in that case, NAN, but First Nations across the country, to get to addressing the long-term drinking water advisories, the short-term drinking water advisories. My nation, where I live, we ship in water, we drive in water. My core concern remains that at the interface, and this is my admonition to the committee and the government and to Canadians and to the world writ large, we have to understand that these circumstances of contestation and to the earlier point about jurisdictional challenges and problems, these points of contestation are actually the opportunities where, say SARM and the province of Saskatchewan and the treaty nations there and many others, farmers, producing food security, came to a conclusion that offered a solution. My point is that this government and all orders of government inspired by the federal government need to proactively invest in it, cut out the funding delays, cut out some of the legal challenges. At the energy water nexus, I would encourage the committee to consider black swan events. What is coming is going to be stuff that we didn't anticipate. It's likely going to be synergistic. It's probably going to be related to things like climate change, emergent disease, and I go back to the COVID issue. COVID proved to me that Canada could have solved the First Nations drinking water crisis because billions of dollars got pushed. Laws changed, bureaucracies at every level, federal, provincial, municipal, territorial, everybody got in line and did something for the good of this country. In my view, we're going to get events like that again. So I strongly suggest that we proactively create some mechanism to, perhaps in NAN, for example, in that territory, find some synergy. Find it in Saskatchewan. Find it on the fisheries issue. Find it in Quebec with the civil code and multiple legal orders aligned. And with the consent of the committee, I will put some written submissions on the particulars of that question because it is a robust one. Masi Cho, thank you for the time.
Thank you for your answer. And I've been up to the Chippewas of the Nawash as well and seen it's not always about just water plants. You need the piping, you need the training, you need all the other infrastructure. And at the same time, putting in broadband along the line to solve other problems at the same time. So it is a complex thing, but yes, you have to have attention. Please.
That point, just on the broadband issue. So I was thinking about Iqaluit and the response to the housing crisis up there. And I think the mayor, recently said that we can build the houses, but we don't have the source water protection. And what I would suggest is, if you look at the synergy between emergent technologies, where I live, we don't have functional broadband, so I run Elon Musk's Starlink. Yesterday, he announced that they just put in the first Neuralink into a human. Technology is changing. Everything is changing fast. I recommend strongly that this committee recommend to government that investment in solving these long-standing crises, human rights crises, should optimize for the evolutionary capacity that you're going to need to deal with the 21st century. And that requires broadband, interfaced and synergistic with hard infrastructure investment, interfaced with legal evolution, led by First Nations, in my respectful view.
Thank you.
Monitoring that goes along with the broadband.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you, Madame Posey.
Thank you.
Madame Posey.
Oui, merci à tout le monde.
Thank you, everyone, and to all of our witnesses for being here. I'm going to start with Ms. Cardenas. There was an article in Le Devoir, and that is the first time I heard about you. You talk about Section 8 of the law about the characteristics of water. I'm completely in agreement, but if there is a legal status given to water, that might be helpful. But later on, you also say that this would be a symbolic gesture of great importance. That's what I'd like to focus on. Symbolic gestures are, of course, admirable, but does that really bring us to protecting the resource? For the past 30 years, I've been thinking about the UN trying to have international laws to protect water. Is there no way to, but there's never been a way to really enforce that. So how could a legal framework be helpful if, of course, there would be rules and laws that would be made be up to date and so on. There could even be sanctions put in place. I'd like to hear your thoughts. Thank you for the question. Section 8 of the Water Act in Quebec is ahead of its time. It recognizes a responsibility. So somebody who causes harm to a body of water can be sued, for example, but only a legal attorney can do that prosecution. But Quebec also gives the right to pollute, so there's a bit of a conflict of interest there. With regards to the legal entity, the idea is to name guardians. They need to dilute that concentration of power so that there are more stakeholders at the table, notably Indigenous nations, NGOs, coastal communities, and so on. And they will be able to speak up for water. The consequences of our actions have polluted water, and we didn't know that before. And so scientists will elucidate us and prevent further damage. If the stakeholders don't want to listen to the science and the warnings of guardians, then there can be a final recourse, which is the courts through sanctions. So financial sanctions or legal sanctions or criminal ones. That's what we're focused on, having very clear rules and applicable sanctions rather than moving towards symbolism. By having symbolic actions, of course, it's interesting, but it won't stop the harm. So if we were to say that the Saint Laurent River or the Magpie River have a symbolic status, would it not give people the impression that there is a fake sense of protection for these bodies of water? Well, the rights of nature have been recognized in certain areas, and that means that our relationship to nature changes because it is considered a person, and therefore it's somebody who can actually be harmed. So the flag of Canada, for example, is not used as a towel, so you will honor the flag. So in this way, we are changing our relationship to the river. It is a legal person, and so now you have to respect it, just like women were not women at a certain era. And why should they receive that kind of status? Well, even the Supreme Court had said that women were not people, but now we do, and so now we can push forward new ideas. So this is a new revolution which will give rights to water. And so if we find ourselves in front of a jury, just like it was done in Equator, will the rights of water prevail on the rights of a corporation? Well, that is the right question to ask. What we're seeing right now is that corporations' rights are always prevailing on the rights of nature. When you take symbolic action, of course, it's nice, but for me, it's not prescriptive and strict enough. I used to be a teacher, so I always need to be strict about things. I'd also like to ask questions to Ms. Delage. You talked about the Canadian Water Agency. Mr. Ben also spoke about it. You've said that the Canadian Water Agency did not elucidate the laws that it operates according to. You've said that the Canadian Water Agency is innovative, but Mr. Ben and Mr. Orb, there has never been an upstream political process in order to determine the guidelines for the Canadian Water Agency. So is it that innovative? Unfortunately, you've run out of time. The answer might come up in a different context.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And my first question, I've got questions for Ms. Vega Cardenas as well, but my first question is for Mr. Ben. You talked a lot about the kind of complexity of the challenges that we're facing and that we are going to be facing in the future, and a little bit about how Indigenous law will play a role in what's to come. And I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit more about how you see the future of Indigenous law interacting with the laws that we have to protect freshwater and the laws that might be potentially doing damage or harm.
Section 5 of the Federal Human Declaration implementation legislation has a positive obligation on Canada to implement and align its laws and policies and regulations with the Human Declaration. So that alone is a positive obligation that requires, in my view, proactive engagement. And there is like a retrospective component to this, which is like laws on the books that we need to deal with, laws in development, and laws forthcoming. My view is that, and this is the core submission, I propose that this committee and the courageous leadership around this table could theoretically advocate for some kind of incubator space that facilitates and supports the homegrown, homespun, as Mr. Orb pointed out, like local people know. And it is my view that Indigenous laws and legal orders, because we have a very different relationality to the non-human, because we view and interface with these non-human entities as having agency, as having breath, as having spirit, as having profundity. Like science is catching up increasingly, and weirdly with the support of AI and like artificial intelligence and machine learning systems that are kind of recognizing like the voice of nature, as put forward by my late mentor and dear friend, the late Dr. Karen Backer. I think that what you're going to see and what I encourage is a push towards, in support of these emergent constructs. And to Committee Member Pause, your question relatedly, I think that emergent constructs in certain jurisdictions, whether it's Saskatchewan or Quebec or anywhere else, that have municipal, First Nations, and other alignment structures, you are likely to find the necessary solutions that then have to be scaled. And my question to the group is that who else but the federal government can functionally scale horizontally or laterally in this system? It is upon you, with the utmost respect, to scale and scale quickly. And I think that is where First Nations, because we don't necessarily disrupt cooperative federalism, we don't necessarily disrupt the complexity of the 91-92 relationship, and yet stand adjacent to and loyal to. I'm Treaty 8, both sides. We've been loyal since 1899, even though my dad went to residential school. Even though my people and myself have been violated time and again by provincial and federal and municipal powers, we stand with you, committed to this thing that is Canada. And I think that is where the utility that we need in the 21st century will be found. And that's my admonition to you.
Thank you so much for that. I'm just reminded of there are 32 calls to action that in my community, the Victoria Municipal Government, alongside the City family, which is made up of the Esquimalt Nation, the Songhees Nation, and urban Indigenous folks, they put out 32 calls. The first 6 of them are on acknowledging the lands and water, and one of them is in particular around establishing areas of Victoria that acknowledge the lands and the waters as having the rights and privileges as entities in and of themselves. And can you talk a little bit more about that future you see with the relation to the non-human?
Okay, so in that context, you're on the breakwater. I went to law school at UVic, so I know a bit about that territory. I had the privilege and honor of being in that space. In 20 years, an Indigenous language coder and allies go to the breakwater and talk in dialogue with orcas and salmon to inform the source water protection structure up above Victoria. People who don't know, the source water is above the city, so there's like a source water protection area. And through machine learning systems and analytics and ceremony and spirit, involving the academics. And, Victoria is a small city, capital city, but has a lot of academics per capita. Visions and interfaces with the municipality, the province, and the federal government to offer insights into source water protection systems, informed and engaging the non-human on a proactive basis. Isn't that a future that Canada should aspire to? We would inspire the world. And the reason is that Canada has the sophisticated infrastructure. We have the sophisticated analytical capacities that other countries do not. We have the legal capacity. We're a multi-juridical jurisdiction. We already have UN declaration legislation in BC, at the municipal level, in Victoria, and at the federal level. We are optimized to do something no one's ever done. And that's my vision. I don't have the technical or coding capacity quite yet to do it, but that might be something that we could aspire to.
It's very interesting. We have to stop there, Ms. Collins, but it's very interesting because the University of Calgary is setting up a environmental prediction center, and it sounds a lot like what you're referring to. So, and they're going to be appearing. We have time for a truncated second round. What I would propose is basically 2 minutes each, 1 minute for NDP and Bloc. I mean, I'm a bit flexible, but just like a few zingers in there, and then we can go on to the second hour with our second panel. So, Monsieur Deltel, vous disposez de 2 minutes.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you to the witnesses for being here. This has all been very interesting. So I have 2 minutes. Mr. Ben, you have been very inspiring for all of us, and thank you for your statements. Ms. Delage and Ms. Cardona, here's a question for you. I used to be a journalist in Quebec, and there was a question we asked Quebec MPs a lot about the cost of water, bottled water, for example. What are your thoughts on that? I know you want legal status for water, but do you think that there should be a price on water? A price on water? Well, I was always against the massive export of water. When I have looked into this question, I've found that water has a lot of value, but it doesn't have a price. It will always be attached to nature. Of course, there is a question of profits, and there are people who profit off of water. And so, of course, there is perhaps a fee that can be distributed to the communities that the water is taken from. But that resource should be a common resource. So with regards to fees, that would be a provincial issue. Is there a difference between the person who bottles water and sells it and the person who uses it for agriculture? What are your thoughts? Using water for agriculture is not price is not the issue. Their contamination is the issue. The water used for irrigation is contaminated and thus contaminates rivers. There is so much production that is done close to rivers, it doesn't respect the bodies of water. And so there's a lot of sedimentation that ends up in the Saint Laurent River, and that is more costly for Canadians. And so we need to have a holistic approach that we must maintain.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
In English, but feel free to answer dans la langue de votre choisissez.
You can answer in the language you want.
Of rights for a river, legal rights and protection for a river. I view rivers as an animate object that sort of should exist on a food chain higher than us. We rely on them. They don't really rely on us. They would be fine without humans around, actually. I spent a lot of time on rivers and lakes, and when I think about all of the life and depth under me, I'm always fascinated with how much I'm physically on top of, but sort of spiritually underneath. So if you could just expand on the concept of rights for these large bodies of animate objects, legal or otherwise. In the last session, we had a meeting with an oil executive who's polluting massive sections of the Athabasca River, and it's having a devastating impact on the health of First Nations people and others. So that's my question. Merci.
In about 1 minute, please. Yeah.
J'ai apporté le document qui explique c'est quoi les droits de la...
I have documents here that explain the rights of the river. It has the right to be protected from pollution. I brought you an article as well that speaks of zones of the Saint Laurent River that have been polluted not just through agriculture but other means that have made the river inappropriate for kayaking. So, because if somebody falls in, they might have to go to the hospital. So that's why we have a vision of rights, because it's easier to identify people who don't comply. So we're identifying major pollution, and this will allow the management of and the legal sanctity of the Saint Laurent River. Thank you for the question. So all of those documents have been submitted to the clerk? Thank you. Yes. Ms. Posé, you have about a minute. So please answer the question that I asked previously. Mr. Ben, and there have been questions on nothing has been democratically established. So how do we correct course? Right now, we're under the impression that we put the horse before, or put the cart before the horse. There is definitely a challenge. It's quite obvious. We talk about water as a resource. An agent or pan-Canadian agents would be able to have a different vision, and various visions of water can be brought together in order to find common ground with regards to those challenges. I'm repeating myself, but we should be moving from an anthropocentric vision, where you just think of water as a resource, towards an ecocentric vision of water that will allow us to have various different visions so that we can find a common ground and maybe compromise so that we could be more productive. One of the functions of the agency would give space to science. Despite what we have discussed, it's not just a local issue. We're talking about major bodies of water, watersheds, and so on, that impacts other regions. And so a water agency would be able for us to make such decisions, and they could be taken across Canada.
Yeah, I have so many questions. I'd love to follow up with all of you afterwards, but maybe just quickly for Ms. Vega Cardenas, can you give your perspective on the Magpie River gaining personhood, and any other examples that you see as kind of paving a pathway forward for us?
Oui, merci pour la question. En fait, c'est la rivière Magpie qui...
Thank you for the question. Magpie River is the first one to have legal recognition, and so it already is a legal person with rights. The guardians of the Innu nation opened up this path so that we could have this vision for the Saint Laurent River as well. We could protect the river, but it also gives power to the local communities who had been abandoned and forgotten. I think the government of Quebec has now taken a stand publicly to respect that decision. They will not be going forward with any projects that might jeopardize the river. I think that was a good message to convey. Next Thursday on CBC, there will be a documentary called I Am the Magpie River.
To know more about how was the processes and how it's gaining more and more vision around the world.
Thank you.
I don't know if I had time to
we'll be
answer
sure
the other,
to tune in.
question.
I have CBC Gem, so I'll be...
Other cases.
Mr.
Okay.
Cram for like 2 minutes.
For squeaking me in at the last minute here. Mr. Orb, could you elaborate on SARM's position on the Lake Diefenbaker irrigation project?
Yes, yeah, definitely. We are in favor of the expansion of Lake Diefenbaker, and not many years ago there was an announcement by the federal government and the province of Saskatchewan that they would expand irrigation, and that was to further food production in our province, keeping in mind that water is very important, especially to farmers that need to irrigate. So we actually have the opportunity quite often to lobby the federal government. We do meet with the province, of course, but we were told by the federal government that the cost of expansion to the province of Saskatchewan would have to be borne by the province totally. That they would need to borrow the money from the Canadian Infrastructure Bank to be able to expand the irrigation, and we're of the opinion that is unfair, because the federal government does contribute to other infrastructure programs, and I can think of rural broadband, of course. So there's a federal program to further that across rural Canada. Also, ICEP, the Investing in Canada infrastructure program, there's a share of federal funding. So we don't understand why the federal government says to our province, you need to borrow the money for an infrastructure program as important as this. We think that the federal government should be funding their share. In the case of all the other agriculture programs and things like that, the federal government bears the cost of 60% of a project, and we think the federal government should be paying attention to that.
Very quick, but
All right, thank you, Mr. Chair. And Mr. Orb, could you quickly share your thoughts on the best way to get regulatory approval for a major infrastructure project such as the Lake Diefenbaker project?
Very, very briefly, please, Mr. Orb.
Well, the best way is, of course, is to have it approved, by the province. In our case, it'd be water security that approves the project. If there is federal funding that goes with it, then the federal government does have a role. But if there isn't, it's entirely up to our province to assess it. Outside of the Environmental Impact Assessment Act, that is how things are approved.
Thank you. Ms. Taylor-Roy.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to the witnesses for being here today. One of the questions I have is regarding if water were given its own intrinsic rights. You've already said that there is always a trade-off between the ability of another level of government, like a province or a federal government, to still pollute or to do something. How would that right of water be ranked, and how would it be enforced? Especially when different governments have different views about the value, whether it's a resource or whether it's elemental, whether it's its own person. How do you see that being enforced? Because I'm thinking of in Ontario, for example, where I live, and numerous different projects put forward by the provincial government that are very much threatening water, but there is no way of challenging that or protecting the water. So perhaps you could answer that for me.
Merci. C'est pas une question facile.
This is not an easy question to answer. Changing someone's perspective on water can take a long time. It took me years. I used to talk about resources a lot, and as we've just said, that is a resource is something that we use for our own benefit and for our own goals. I use paper to communicate, for example. That's a resource. But when you think about water as somewhere where life exists, and Indigenous people will say that it is alive, but non-Indigenous people will say that it is a living environment. Maybe we might not understand the same way, but we are not the only species in the world, and we can consider that water is part of an environment, and we can't separate it. We sometimes say, water is one thing, fish is another, plants are another thing, but it's actually all part of the same thing. I think we can bring those ideas together. The river is alive, and it is a living ecosystem, an environment. So for us, it's a legal person.
Canada Water Agency and the coordination that hopefully it will have with different levels of government and Indigenous people, whether First Nations or Métis or Inuit. Would you see that as the place to be protecting those rights of water if, in fact, it were established?
Rapidement, s'il vous plaît. Oui.
Oui, en fait,
Very quickly. We're presenting an operational model with 3 pillars: a committee of guardians, a strategic committee where all you stakeholders will be around the table to think of what is in the best interest of the river. Everyone will say that it's in their best interest, but the guardian must always have the best interest of the body of water at heart. So there will also be a scientific committee, which can be the role of the Canadian Water Agency, and they will help take the best decisions. I think we must not forget that the agency will not be a regulatory body. Rather, it's an organization or a committee that will allow collaboration.
Discussion. I would encourage you to send us any written analyses. Mr. Ben alluded to this, because it's a very hard issue to grasp. So anything that you could provide in a written note with additional insights would be greatly appreciated by the committee members and the analysts. So thank you very much for this discussion. We're going to break for literally 2 minutes to onboard someone for the next panel. So thank you again to the witnesses. To the members, I would like you to think about something over the next couple of days, which we've agreed that we want to travel to the Curl site and to Fort Chipewyan in the spring. If you could give some thought to which non-sitting week you would like to travel, perhaps it's the week in May. So if you could just think about it, and if you see me in the House, if you could just maybe let me know what you think, and we can approve a particular time slot very quickly at the next meeting, so that the House team can prepare an itinerary and budget. I don't want to spend too much time discussing this here at the committee, so if you can see me informally, we could come to a consensus, I'm sure. Thank you again. Merci. Merci beaucoup. Thank you.
Thank you so much. to start the second panel. Mr. Brandis had to leave during our break because we went over the allotted time. He could only stay until 5:30. So we are going to go until 6:30 today. So Mr. Atchison is with us on Zoom. We have Ms. Pacro, who is here in person, I believe. We also have Mr. Jacques and Mr. Cooper from the Water Security Agency. Are they in person or are they online? Ms. Clerk, Madam Clerk, they're here?
OK, alors on va commencer.
All right, so we will begin. We'll start with 5 minutes for the opening remarks. Mr. Atchison, you have 5 minutes to share your opening remarks. Go ahead.
Well, thank you. So my name is Aaron Atchison. I'm a partner at Miller Thomson in London, Ontario, and leader of our firm's projects group. Thank you very much for the opportunity to speak to the committee today. I write regularly on water issues in Water Canada, and recently wrote a piece in respect of legal personhood for waterways with one of my colleagues, Catherine Cavan. And I certainly think that who speaks for nature and in particular for waterways, this is a question that raises potential conflicts. Certainly, local First Nations must be part of the answer. But what happens when there are multiple First Nations that seek to speak for a waterway, other communities, other stakeholders? What happens when some manner of impingement on a river is necessary for the greater benefit of the communities in an area? And I would start by saying that I don't think that legal personhood for waterways needs to mean negative consequences for well considered and planned infrastructure projects. But if the relevant right of nature here is legal standing simply to take a party, presumably a government approval authority, to court over a decision, how do we effectively avoid legal personhood for a waterway becoming another source of delays in moving forward with infrastructure projects in our country? So it's our view, myself and my co-author, that it's critical that we engage problem solvers, solution-minded individuals in the representation of waterways. It would be a failure of those of us involved to allow this concept of legal personhood to become just another way for the not in my backyard elements in our society to delay or kill projects without offering alternatives to achieve the needed advances that are needed to meet the needs of both humans and nature. One of the questions that needs to be determined effectively is how we make expertise and knowledge available to the stewards or guardians of a waterway. Should people with such knowledge and expertise be encouraged to become the guardians themselves, or should they be available as resources to ensure that decisions are made with full knowledge of the circumstances, the options, etc.? In parallel to assisting in determining who speaks for a waterway, I think it would be advantageous for us to allow for input from the waterway early in the planning process for infrastructure projects. That said, it would not be beneficial to effectively twin the environmental assessment process for every project with associated delays. Just for a moment, to consider an example of a new wastewater treatment facility planned to ensure that wastewater created by humans is treated and does not affect the drinking water sources for various communities. The treated wastewater out the far end of the system needs to go somewhere, and traditionally that would be an area waterway. If that waterway runs through traditional territory of multiple First Nations, through other communities, who speaks for the waterway in assessing whether the municipality planning the wastewater treatment plant has sufficiently addressed the health and well-being of the waterway? It's a complex problem, requires knowledge of the areas involved and the river, but also knowledge and expertise related to the technologies being considered for the new infrastructure and the associated risks involved. And a no, not here is just not an acceptable answer, given the need for all human beings to have safe drinking water in that case. I think the most critical question may be how we induce the stewards of a waterway to consider options that minimize the negative effects on the river while allowing infrastructure to proceed, and then how this information makes its way into the planning process. And I am certainly not an expert in how other governments have proceeded and sought to include the impact, information provided on behalf of a river, but certainly we should be looking at other jurisdictions. There are, roughly a dozen, I believe, countries that have experience now with rights of nature, and so could speak to this.
Thank you, Mr. Atchison. Professeur Pacro, vous avez la parole pour 5.
Professor Pacro, you have the floor for 5 minutes. From the get-go, I would like to specify something. First, the format of such consultations is not easy for a professor or for a researcher. It's against nature in a way, because normally we are supposed to demonstrate what we're saying, but with 5 minutes you can only present them. I'll tell you from the get-go that there is an entire book that has been published, and I invite you to read it. It's on the Water Agency. Secondly, I'd like to make it clear that my main area of expertise is international law and global water governance. So it is incidental that I'm looking at all of these issues, because international rights issues usually come from sovereign states. So whatever is happening in various states are the limits as to what we can do internationally. The other reason I've accepted to come here is because I realized that there are a lot of questions or issues internationally that concern of the water management systems in federations. It is analogous to what we're trying to do when we are trying to govern in a collaborative way. I will focus on 3 blind spots that I took sight of when we were doing our examination on the Water Agency. Here are the 3 blind spots. First, plurality. Second, 2 things that are related to the water as an object. So the hydrological cycle and the carrying capacity of ecosystems. These are important angles to take into consideration. First of all, the concept of plurality. There is a thesis for those who might be interested. It was written in published in 2016 by Frédéric Julien that talks about the Canadian perspective and the various ways Canadians approach water. In various consultations across Canada, we've noticed that people are more concerned about diversity based on identities rather than ideas. As a result, often during consultations, dissension doesn't, consensus is not reached, and then we wonder why. So the idea is to revisit our way of consulting various people so that various perspectives of water could come out. We're not going to fix these conflicts by hiding the fact that there are these different perspectives. In Canada, there is obviously a very big cognitive bias from the government's part on water. This appeared in 2002 at the Human Rights Commission when Canada was the only one who opposed a resolution on the rights of water when NGOs asked Canada in writing to justify this negative vote. Canada said that it was an obstacle for Canada with regards to access to their water resources. So it's important to understand what the idea or the perspective of water is before thinking about governance. So a Canadian agency, with that in mind, as it is, since it requires collaboration and is meant as such, therefore it is an important element that must be politically given upstream of this work. This brings us to our second blind spot. Canada looks at water as a resource on which it has sovereignty. Historically, Canada has not been a state that was innovative, I'd say, with regards to international water rights. One of the reasons we should create a water agency in Canada is to clearly state the responsibility of Canada in protecting the hydrological cycle. We have an issue internationally. Many states deny the hydrological cycle. We saw how long it took for them to even recognize climate change. If we take that much time for water, things won't go well. I'm so sorry, but we've gone over time. You will still have the opportunity to talk about these issues later. Now, on to Mr. Jacques, who will be speaking on behalf of the Water Security Agency.
5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to the committee for inviting us here today to speak about water management in Saskatchewan. Canada is a water superpower, and across our great land, but especially in Saskatchewan, Manitoba, our water is key to our prosperity. It sustains economies, turns aspirations to realities, and helps communities reach their full potential. Ensuring a substantial supply of water is crucial to the future growth and prosperity of the prairies, be it in agriculture, manufacturing, energy, or an array of other industries. These are Minister Jolie's words from the Prairie Prosperity Report, a vision for water management, the Management of Water Resources report published in 2020. And the report focused on the unrealized potential of irrigation at Lake Diefenbaker. Creating a large and secure supply of water in the prairies was discussed for many years in Saskatchewan, and discussions gained momentum following the crushing droughts of the 30s. The decision to proceed with the project was made in 1959 with construction and completed in 1967. And Lake Diefenbaker was formed by the construction of the Gartner Dam and the Qu'Appelle River Dam. Lake Diefenbaker was envisioned to provide water for power generation, irrigation, drinking, and urban and industrial development. And today, Lake Diefenbaker provides significant supply for hydroelectric power, drinking water for nearly 2/3 of the province, and water for urban and industrial development in the central area of Saskatchewan. And the irrigation potential of the lake, however, has never been fully realized. Pump houses and canals were built during the construction of the project, and today irrigation is operational on the east side of the lake, and unfortunately work was discontinued on the west side in 1973 by the provincial government of the day, when canal construction was already 90% completed. The West Side project was never finished, and as a result, today we see many kilometers of dry canal with concrete structures that have never been used. Lake Diefenbaker has the potential for up to 500,000 acres of irrigation acres, and we are now focused on building out irrigation infrastructure on the west side of Lake Diefenbaker. Lake Diefenbaker irrigation project represents one of the most unique opportunities in Canada to deliver on food security, climate resiliency, and economic growth. Irrigation enables producers to grow diverse, high-value crops, which increases on-farm profitability and enables value-added processing, business attraction, and employment. The project would create thousands of new jobs in construction and the duration of operation. and it represents potentially billions in new tax revenue for both the provincial and the federal governments. Most estimates say global food production must rise by 70% by 2050 to feed the projected 9 billion people around the world. What increased irrigation at this scale means for Canada is the reduced reliance on food imports. Increased irrigation not only allows our country to grow more food per acre, but grow different crops, replacing costlier food imports that must travel further distances to reach our grocery shelves. The Water Security Agency has undertaken significant engagement activities with local communities, rural municipalities, stakeholder groups, and Indigenous rights holders. In total, the project team has engaged in 18 in-person meetings with Indigenous communities. And these meetings included information and education on the project itself, as well as the economic benefits it could provide to irrigators, agri-food production, and other processing opportunities. And I would say the feedback so far from these meetings has been very positive, and we look forward to ongoing engagement with the public and Indigenous rights holders as the work on the project continues. One of the frequent questions that I'm asked is there enough water for a project of this size? And the short answer is yes. In preparing for some of the preliminary work of these projects, WSA examined nearly 90 years of flow data to better understand the water supply and its availability and sustainability. And we found with normal operations, there is almost 900,000 acre-feet of water available, and these projects, when fully built out, would use less than 700,000 acre-feet per year. For some perspective, each year water lost due to evaporation equals about 4% of the annual inflow into Lake Diefenbaker, and these projects would use around 2% of annual inflow. We believe the time for the project to move forward is now. The projects hold immense potential for Canada with strengthened food security, climate resilience, water sustainability, and lasting economic benefits. Building the Lake Diefenbaker's projects would be a tangible step towards achieving these goals and solidifying Canada's position as a global leader. And over 50 years ago, we built Lake Diefenbaker together, and now is the time to fulfill the national historic vision and secure our future. Thank you, Mr.
Thank you very much. Mr. Cram for 6 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and thank you to all the witnesses for being here today. My questions will be for Mr. Jacques and Mr. Cooper from the Saskatchewan Water Security Agency. First off, could you explain to the committee the benefits to farmers and to agriculture of having abundant access to an irrigation system and fresh water as compared to just relying on rainwater for farmers?
Yes, thanks, Mr. Cram. I'll start, and then Mr. Cooper can jump in. But what I would say, especially in years when there's drier conditions, I mean, it gives producers that certainty to have enough water to produce a crop. They are, for example, this year we saw some of the irrigated yields on Durham, for example, to be close to 100 bushels an acre in the irrigation district, where the dry land production was, under 30 bushels per acre. So it gives the producers that certainty. But I would say it's the ability to start growing higher value crops, diverse crops, and we are seeing examples of that, in our province. I don't know if you have anything to.
No, I think you covered it well. I would maybe add just a couple of things. In recent years, we've had challenges with food security, and I think what we're seeing now is the ability to grow more table-ready foods locally is a big benefit. And so I think expanding irrigation creates more of those opportunities, so that's another benefit.
And could you elaborate on some of the types of crops that could be grown with access to this irrigation system that are not being grown right now?
Yeah, so what we're seeing, we are seeing some of the existing irrigation already, vegetable production. We're seeing some specialty crops. There was one producer I was aware of that grew, different varieties of irrigated beans that normally wouldn't be grown in our province. We're seeing a local company growing, carrots for local production and local grocery stores in our province. So I think those are the opportunities that are there.
Now, part of the role of this committee is to make recommendations about the role of the new Canada Water Agency. Could you explain from your perspective and from the perspective of the Lake Diefenbaker project, what would be a useful role for the Canada Water Agency to play to move projects like this forward, and what would maybe be a not so useful role?
So maybe I'll just back up a little bit, maybe for the committee's interest. Water Security Agency in Saskatchewan, we're a unique organization in the country where everything water-related is under one agency. And so, we advance, different water management initiatives, that are required to support, the provincial economy, the quality of life for Saskatchewan residents, while protecting, the environment. We're responsible for all the regulation in the province. We hand out the water licenses to different users, regardless who the user is. We do a number of monitoring activities to make sure, the rivers and the water streams are safe. And so, that's been, I guess, our concern right from the get-go when we had some early conversations, is that long as we're not duplicating services that are already provided within our province, because we're already providing that. But if the agency is there to help provide some fundings, opportunities, as Mr. Orb spoke about earlier, or maybe some of that science or collaboration or the research side.
Okay, very good. In your opening statement, you used the term climate resiliency. Could you explain what climate resiliency means and how the Lake Diefenbaker project can play a positive role?
Yeah, the Lake Diefenbaker does just do that. I mean, in dry years, it's providing an ample supply of water that can be used to, whether it's for our communities or agriculture production. It's making water available on drier years. It also helps. We have seen years where there's been excess water, and it helps provide, protection against flooding. But when I think about, when it comes to agriculture production, it's making sure producers have that, stable supply of water that they need to grow the crops. But it also can be used for, providing water or making water available for communities as well, should they need a source of water.
I'd maybe add a little bit. So in terms of resilience and adaptation, the project is very helpful because research has been done in terms of what we can expect in climate change scenarios with precipitation. And what they're saying is the volumes should remain steady or perhaps increase if you're able to capture and store. And so Lake Diefenbaker is very helpful in the sense that it can capture water whenever we're lucky enough to receive it, and you can benefit from irrigation that way. So it provides us that resiliency in case of future droughts.
Okay, thank you very much. And Mr. Chair, I'd like to give my remaining time to Mr. Mazier.
You have about 40 seconds.
Mr. Chair, I'd like to move the following motion.
Okay.
Mr. Chair, I'd like to go on the speaking list, please.
Okay.
Given that the Liberal government has started a process that would force pizzerias, bagel shops, and any establishment that uses wood-fired oven to run their businesses to track their emissions and to report them to the federal government through a national registry, according to a statement from the Minister Guilbeault's department. The committee expresses opposition to this current process initiated by the Minister of Environment and abandoned any plans to ban the use of wood-fired ovens and report this to the House. And the committee immediately called Minister Guilbeault, departmental officials from the departments of the Environment and Natural Resources to appear before the committee within 2 weeks of this motion being adopted. The fact that we must address this matter is simply ridiculous. Canadians couldn't believe what they read when they opened the newspaper the other day. The headline in the Montreal Gazette read, and I quote, "The federal agency sizing up air pollution from bagel shops."
Monsieur le Président,
I believe.
Mr. Chair,
je demanderai le respect des personnes invitées. Je ne pense pas que ce...
I'd ask that we respect our witnesses. I think this is off topic. I'm so sorry, but I feel like I'm wasting my time here. I understand you, but sadly, only members can intervene on this question. I don't know who is Miss Collins who brought up the point of order. I don't know if it's because you're using a newspaper, but you're not allowed to do that. It's one of the rules that we have at the House of Commons. You can't use a prop.
Props.
In committee.
Yeah, that's right.
I've had props before.
Well, I don't know where, but
So
anyway, is that your point of order, Ms. Collins?
My point of order was that I was hoping that the Conservative member would put down the prop, and also was curious if he was feeling a bit ashamed about these kind of tactics.
No, it is a prop. I mean, it's clearly been produced for the purpose of showing it off. But anyways.
It's okay. I'll start up from
Yeah.
I guess it is ridiculous that we have to actually mention this. So I'll clarify what's going on here, because everybody's saying this is not actually factual. But the headline in the Montreal Gazette read, and I quote, as I had here, "The federal agency sizing up air pollution from bagel shops and pizzerias." Another quote, "A federally run agency is considering forcing wood-burning businesses to report emissions." We have a cost of living crisis. People can't afford homes. There is a wave of crime on the streets, and this Liberal government is focused on bagel shops and oven-fired ovens. Regulate, tax, and plan. That's the approach of this Liberal government. These aren't just my words. Here's a statement from the Environment Minister's own department, and I quote, "The National Pollutant Release and Inventory Program has recently undertaken compliance promotion activities targeting some wood-fired ovens such as pizzerias and bagel shops across Canada." End of quote.
Order.
Came-
Mr. Mazur has the floor. He can speak as long as he wants. Go ahead,
This
Mr.
came
Mazur.
right from ECCC. Imagine your small pizza and bagel owner. They're probably thinking that they're thankful that they got through COVID and things are improving. And then you get an email from the Liberal government wanting to know how many emissions are coming out of your wood-fired oven. We just learned that the Liberal government doesn't measure annual emissions reduced from their carbon tax. But the Liberals expect pizzerias to know how many emissions come from their oven. Absolutely ridiculous. Small businesses can't afford this government's high-priced consultants. This is such an embarrassing issue for the government that I expect will try to shut down debate on this motion. They love shutting down debate on issues they don't want to talk about. If the government is truly opposed to a wood-fired oven ban, then they would have no problem supporting this motion. Thank you, Chair.
Mr. Vancouverden.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm surprised. I'm not surprised. I'm just disappointed, actually, that the Conservatives are amplifying conspiracy theories once again. The only member of Parliament or official from any level of government associated with this committee or any other committee who has visited a bagel shop to take photos and to do that is Mr. Mazur, who did that for his social media channels to promote this as his. I have bagels all the time. I love bagels. St. Viateur and Kettleman's are both great bagel shops. But they're interrupting this committee to spread misinformation. They are wasting our witnesses' time, as they do all of the time. Conservatives are the only one calling this out because it's a conspiracy theory that's just cooked up, baked up by Pierre Poilievre. There have been no ECCC in-person inspections of wood-fired pizza and bagel shops. There are lots of articles from clean air advocates talking about some of the more industrial-sized ones that are causing air quality issues in various communities. But the NPRI does not set emission reduction targets. Its goal is to promote awareness and enhance the understanding of pollution in communities across Canada through annual reporting. Now, either the member doesn't understand how Canada's national pollutant release inventory works, which would be problematic if you're going to do this much work on it and do social media on it, or that he knows it's false and he's going to promote it anyway for clicks and for attention, which is unfortunately something that we've come to expect from the Conservatives, particularly this one. It's atrocious that the Conservatives continue to bring conspiracy theories to this committee and waste our witnesses' time. So for that reason, I'm happy to debate it at a time when we have time for that, but right now we have witnesses here, so I would move to adjourn debate on this silly motion.
Rappel au règlement ou
Là, on doit voter sur la motion de...
OK.
We have to vote on the motion.
Mr. Ali? Yes. Madame Chatel? Mr. Longfield?
Agreed.
Ms. Taylor-Roy?
Bien sûr.
Mr. Vancouverden?
Yes.
Mr. Dautel?
No.
Mr. Cram? Opposed. Mr. Leslie?
No.
Mr. Mazur?
Opposed.
Madame Posey? Ms. Collins?
In favor.
Okay, So, okay, we'll go now to Ms. Chatel, Madame Chatel, for 6 minutes, please.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I was very happy to hear some of what you had to say. I, too, think that there is a beautiful vision that is coming up for agriculture in Canada, and we are living in a world that will have an increasing number of droughts globally. I was looking at recent statistics that predict outcomes for the south of the United States. Droughts will be more common. Agriculture in Canada will be a pillar of the Canadian economy, but also from a humanitarian standpoint to feed the world. And for that, we need water and we need to protect it. It is a resource, of course, but as we saw among various panels, there's also a gem that needs to be protected. With that in mind, as my colleague Mr. Krem was saying earlier, we implemented a Canadian Water Agency in order to have a different vision in Canada. I'd like to know your thoughts. You are an agency that does have the experience of dealing with various levels of government. What are your recommendations for the Canadian Water Agency based on your experience, how to work with various provinces, but also with Indigenous nations and other organizations, such as your own, for example?
I'll start. Thank you for the question, and I'll have Mr. Cooper add to it. But I think, when I think of the Canada Water Agency, we've had limited interaction. We had a couple early meetings when they were looking at establishing it at the official level. And, we spent, I know ourselves and some of my neighboring provinces spent some time talking about, what the role would look like and making sure, we have like I said, in Saskatchewan, we're doing all that regulatory type work. And we didn't want to see any duplication of services because that just, it doesn't make sense. We in Saskatchewan, we sit on a board with Manitoba and Alberta, the Prairie Provinces Water Board, that manage, water that flows through, each of our provinces. We work collaboratively. We also sit on some international boards where we work with our neighbors to the south on making sure apportionment agreements are met. So I think, in Saskatchewan with our agency, we have, already good working relationship with, those that we need to collaborate. We do a lot of work in our day-to-day operations in a province with First Nations. There's some examples where, we've transferred some water bodies to different First Nations in their treaty land entitlement process. We've worked on some, whether it be some economic activity, some economic opportunities that they had. We worked with them on that, on land that we own. So I think, we're doing that right now. I don't know if there's anything you want to add, David.
No, I think you covered it well.
And again, maybe I'll go back to my comment that I made in I think Mr. Cram asked the question. If there's some opportunity, for helping with funding in different types of projects, I think that's a space that the Canada Water Agency can play. If there's some support that they can provide in maybe some research, that's also a place. But I think duplicating work that provinces are doing wouldn't be helpful.
Merci. Puis, on a reçu
Taylor McCann, who is from my own writing from the Agri-Food Institution, that they need more more data on how water is used to protect water in agriculture as well. He referred to a lack of data. Is that a role that the Canadian Water Agency could take on?
Yeah, I suppose that there could be. Again, when I can't speak for other jurisdictions, but I know in our own province, again, we capture that data. We monitor we have a number of monitoring stations on the major rivers that flow in and out of our province. So we know how much water is coming in. We work with irrigators. We work with communities or industries that are using our water to monitor, what they are using. So there's probably there could be a role they can play, but we're already capturing some of that. I'm sorry, I didn't translate.
Pardon. Alors, vous avez...
So you have data for agriculture and how water is used in agriculture?
You maybe could hear that.
Yeah, no, thank you for the question. At a local level, it's difficult to capture that degree of detail. I think, the data we capture it would be at a larger level than that. So without kind of knowing the particulars of the concerns that have been raised by your constituent, I'm not exactly sure how to answer that question, but I would say that, there's a lot of research that goes into agriculture and water jointly with the Ministry of Agriculture in the province and with our stakeholders at the university as well.
Thank you. Thank you. Madame Posey.
On to Ms. Posey. Thank you to all our witnesses for being here. Thank you for being among us. Ms. Pagro, I can hear that you're very passionate about what you do. I had the opportunity to read the 7th chapter of the book you mentioned earlier. I invite all of my colleagues to read it. It's very interesting, and it is about the Canadian Water Agency and its probable blind spots. There's a lot of peril afoot. Is it the economic, industrial resources, the common goods and heritage? Politicians sometimes don't take care of these issues, and they neglect jurisdiction or applying jurisdiction. And when they have jurisdiction, they don't actually apply it. And so I'd like to quote you and what you said about the Canadian Water Agency. The very idea reproduces the problem of the reconciling both realities. That's what we were talking about. We want a subsidiarity of the agencies or another organizational system, that 50 bodies of water in Canada should precede this kind of initiative. There have been other witnesses that talked a lot about watersheds. So can you tell us more about the Canadian context and tell us how we could develop a structure like the Canadian Water Agency, but that would truly improve what is prevailing today and would not overstep on anyone's boundaries or jurisdictions, rather, because we are in Canada? Thank you for the question. I'll start by the end. With regards to overstepping on certain jurisdictions, that's what I was talking about when I mentioned that what is done internationally is done federally as well. When there are multiple different tools, then there might be a bit of tension with regards to the management of those resources or issues. There is no magic solution. I think that the main idea should be to come back to what the motto "Think locally, act globally," or "Think globally, act locally," rather, means, and truly apply the issue of subsidiarity. In all environmental issues, and water especially because it flows and travels, there is an interconnectedness between the local and the global. If there is pollution in polar bears' flesh, it's because our pollution travels. Inuits in the Great White North have not been producing the chemicals that find themselves in polar bears. So what is produced in one place has an impact on the global cycle, and that needs to be accepted. Back to what we were saying earlier, there was a lot about to say about vision, and you talked about what was symbolic. Rather than symbolic, it's more about how we perceive it and how we conceive of it. Because if water is a resource, then we will not take into consideration the disruptions to the hydrological cycle that can happen through changes we're making. Infrastructure. Cape Town was almost became the first city in the world a few years ago who couldn't provide drinking water to its citizens. When you look at South Africa, it was almost done intentionally, because rainfall is not most common in the places where there are agriculture. They actually drove that water elsewhere. And so the hydrological cycle changed and it just didn't work anymore. When we make decisions administratively, they don't have anything to do with water. Maybe you will decide that your institutions, locally, municipally, federally, are more important, but the hydrological cycle doesn't care. The small cycle and the big hydrological cycle, both of them. At COP21 in Paris, there was a lot of action that was taken in order to demonstrate how the small cycle, hydrological cycle, locally, if it were better managed, it could actually counter climate change effects. So it's a very important issue. We need to accept that we are part of a cycle. We keep hearing the word systemic in Canada with regards to various topics, but we haven't really understood it with regards to the environment. If you take subsidiarity seriously, then there need to be rules and sanctions and measures at every level. But there must also be a willingness, a political will, really, if we are in a democracy, that is stated and implemented in order for every level to be subjected to those main principles that we've agreed upon. But we haven't done that yet in Canada. We just haven't gotten there in Canada at all. I could listen to her for hours, but time is up. I'm sorry, I am a teacher. I'm a professor, rather. Ms. Collins.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. This is also to Ms. Pecro. Thank you so much for joining our committee. Granting personhood to the St. Lawrence River is a project that one of my colleagues, Alexandre Boulouris, the MP for Rosemont-le-Petit-Patray, has been fighting alongside many advocates, etc., Indigenous nations in Quebec for many years. Can you talk a little bit about how granting personhood to rivers might impact government's responsibility to environmental protection, and what you see as potentials in these movements?
Bon.
Well, the objective is the same, but in my opinion, there is a strategic difference. I am trained in environmental, legal, and political science. So for me, the issue with regards to efficiency is to see where things can change in the most realistic way, and where those things can actually be efficient. I come from the human rights sector. What's important with human rights is not the legal part, but it's the obligation. That's why I work on strengthening the responsibilities of public authorities. Someone once said that we only have a certain set of rights, so it would be the same thing with rivers. My first objection is with regards to the strategy. I think it would be more beneficial and we would be able to reach our goal if we sanction responsibility than by adopting rules. I'm looking at what's been happening over the last 50 years. when I say that. And then second, as a political scientist, our obsession is power. Giving human rights to non-human entities when law is a fiction in itself, well, it doesn't work out. If you gave it, corporations got legal rights, persons' rights, and there have been human rights issues that have been brought up that are taken on by corporations rather than people. So there is a question of balance, and so the main argument is to say that there should be a bigger balance, and we should give rights to water because we've given it to corporations. Indeed, that is a good argument, but strategically, I have the following impression. I'm sorry, but Israel, Gaza, look at what's happening now. The only tools we have is the responsibility of obligations, because rights that have been stated really need political will to be applied. So if there is no political willingness to apply them, you can put anything in the law. You will not get the results that you want. And the last thing I'll say is that through that responsibility, you can reach the indigenous ideas, because they use our language, because they hear us talk. But there you go.
To the committee, I will have to leave. I'll be replaced by my amazing colleague, Mr. Garrison. But maybe just, how much time do I have left, Mr. Chair?
Minute and a half.
Okay, great. Maybe just in the last minute and a half, can you speak a little bit to the corporate exploitation? You mentioned corporations getting personhood, but in particular the exploitation of water, things like, we've seen from Nestle here in North America, but also around the world, and the damage that that's doing to communities.
You have 60 seconds, but you can continue later. Well, generally speaking, I think that this comes from national rights. When a company can grab water, it's different in every country.
So we'll do a second round, but a truncated second round like the first time. So basically 2-2, 1-1, 2-2. Just short snappers. Go ahead, Mr. Cram.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Chair, and we'll get back to Mr. Jacques and Mr. Cooper from the Saskatchewan Water Security Agency. In the previous round, you suggested that a useful role that the Canada Water Agency could play would be with providing technical expertise. Could you elaborate a little bit on what technical expertise the Canada Water Agency could provide that the Saskatchewan Water Security Agency does not presently have?
Thank you for the question. I wouldn't say that there's anything that really jumps out at us in terms of an area where we feel like there would be support within that vein. But I think, we'd met earlier this week with MP Duguid, and he had talked about the disjointed way water is managed at the federal level. And so, I think maybe that as a touch point for us would be beneficial to not have to go to various departments. So that does come to mind as one area where focus could benefit us. Yeah.
And you also talked about sources of funding. Has the Lake Diefenbaker project applied for federal funds in any form?
Thank you again for the question. Yeah, we've had a number of interactions, and the usual response is to engage with the CIB, which we have, but I think, as has been raised earlier today, the concern is that it is, in essence, a loaning entity, and so we've been asked if we can to try to find a grant partner, and so we have applied through the Disaster Mitigation Adaptation Fund in its previous intake and have another application forward in its current intake, so that's where we've applied for money.
So the Disaster Mitigation Adaptation Fund, and how is that application going? Has it been rubber stamped? Is it still waiting for approval? Where is it at?
So the current intake is currently pending. At the closure of the previous intake, we did have a debrief, which was very good. They talked about how the project really met the criteria that they're looking for through that program, but due to the scale of the ask, they were unable to fund it at that time, but they did acknowledge that it did check many of the boxes that they're looking for.
Thank you. Mr. Ali.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you to witnesses for being here. My question is to Mr. Atchison. Can you please tell us more about your work and the types of challenges you see in your career related to freshwaters?
Oh, thank you. Well, I'm a projects lawyer, so I generally work on completing, infrastructure projects from inception through to financing and construction. In terms of challenges, and in the water area, similar to many others, I do a lot of work in the renewable energy space as well, and we regularly have, unfortunately, we have clients or prospective clients and partners of our clients that decide not to move forward investing in Canada and participating in projects in Canada because of what they've heard about our inability to move forward on projects to get mired in approvals processes. And so we've been successful moving a variety of different projects forward, but I would say that the vast majority of my clients that have been successful are Canadian, and I'm proud to work with a wide range of Canadian enterprises, including those owned and operated by First Nations groups and others. But there definitely is, there have been projects that are called off, are slowed down, do not happen, simply because of the specter of the difficulty there is to get projects done of various kinds in our country. And I guess that is one of the things that I was thinking about when we penned our paper in this area.
Thank you.
That the legal personhood
Thank you.
point, not thank you.
Madame Posé, 1 minute environ.
On va parler de l'Agence canadienne de...
So we're going to talk about the Canadian Water Agency, of course. When I read your chapter, you had the same considerations as Mr. Ben earlier. There will be decisions that won't actually be made. There's no democracy there. What will be the consequence of not taking that process into consideration? Mainly, we will be reproducing the dissensions that already exist around the management of a resource, if you will, but they will also be amplified. Conflicts around water will increase. I don't remember which witness said that, but they will increase. If we don't have the means to address those conflicts, then the means to fix them won't be very democratic, I don't think. As a society, we're moving towards an environmental issue, and we are using more than what our ecosystem can give us, and there will be consequences. But we also don't have the means to distribute the inconvenience and the advantages, because there will be regions where that will benefit more than others, or will fare better. Mr. Gerritsen, do you want to ask something briefly? You have 1 minute.
I would like to continue with Ms. Hackrow. Just one of the things I'm always concerned about is the shared governance as a part of reconciliation with Indigenous people. And I'm just always interested in examples where shared governance helps solve some of these problems. And when it comes to freshwater, what your experience is shared governance with Indigenous peoples over freshwater.
Sur la question des peuples autochtones.
With regards to Indigenous people, as Mr. Ben said earlier, events where there was reconciliation and an ability to manage conflicts peacefully are those files where there was political dissent, or decision rather, so that results would be shared. The values that we were aiming for would be discussed. There were difficult discussions because there are multiple visions of water in Canada. But once it was done, it was more successful. That's when you find success. Across the world, there is this issue of integrating water resources, and we thought that that was the best way to go ahead. But the only way that worked is when there was a political phase that defined the objectives ahead of time. So that is really essential. Mr. Cram.
Mr. Chair, I would like to finish with Mr. Aitchison, if I may. Mr. Aitchison, in your opening statement, you suggested that giving legal personhood to lakes and rivers is maybe not a very good idea. I was wondering if you could elaborate on how the government can ensure environmental protection of lakes and rivers and ensure an efficient and effective project approval process without granting legal personhood to lakes and rivers.
Well, thank you. I'm not certain that it has to be the case that this is a problem. I think it matters much more who the individuals are and the bounds within which we consider these things. If we were looking to better our processes and avoid an additional venue through legal personhood concept, just simply viewing the river through from the perspective that First Nations have asked us to within our existing approval processes, that I would expect that could provide some considerable benefits and much less complexity.
And can you speak to the added levels of complexity that granting legal personhood to lakes and rivers could add to the process?
Well, I think thank you. I think the concern would be that we would effectively be duplicating our environmental assessment process, but with another venue, and that could run at least that could run at a similar time span. The worst case scenario would be that we provide legal standing and eventually have a judicial review of each approval once it's granted at the end of a project approval process.
Thank you. I think Mr. Longfield to bring us home, as they say.
Sure, thank you. And I'm going to continue with Mr. Aitchison and also just let you know that Catherine Cavan, your co-author, was in preschool with my youngest daughter. And so we go back over 30 years, so you can do the math on that. I'd be very interested in the paper that you've co-written, both from a personal standpoint. I'm sure my wife would love to read it as well. It would be a hit at our house. But for the purposes of our study, whether there are international comparators, if Canada has 20% of the global freshwater supply, how critical it is that we look at every avenue of protection that we can, including the legal avenues around personhood.
Right. Well, I mean, there's, like I said earlier, I think there's probably a dozen countries that have experience with this in some way. The one that's where they've been to the courts the most often has been in Ecuador, I believe. And unfortunately, the situation in Ecuador has been roughly, as we spoke about in our article, has been roughly that where the First Nation or the guardians of the river were objecting to a government approval process, it did not result in a change in approval, just simply a delay. But where government was using this to establish, the course forward, that's where this was kind of used to ratify things. So unfortunately, I don't think in the case of Ecuador, they have provided a good example, and we should be learning from some of these lessons.
So it could provide clarity where clarity is needed.
It could.
Okay, well, I would love to see the paper, so please do share it back with us through the clerk, and we'll spend some time on that. Thank you very much for being here. And say hi to Catherine.
Et merci, merci collègues, merci à nos témoins.
Thank you, colleagues, and thank you to our witnesses. This was a very intellectual discussion and one that was very stimulating. Thank you for the time that you've given us, especially given that we had delays. So, great evening to everyone, and we'll see you on Thursday at 3:30. Thank you.